You're listening to episode 294. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sara Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers. Tim, what's the state of public discourse?
Well, Sara, I'm going to give you my answer. It's my opinion based upon what I've experienced. And in my lifetime, it feels like public discourse has hit an all-time low. We can see the evidence of it in the media, social media, and even in real life, even in the church. And, recently, especially in the church. And sometimes the hardest place isn't public discourse, but it's really in the one-to-one conversations we have.
So if public or individual discourse is all about spoken or written communication between people, where do we stand as Christ-centered leaders?
That's a great question. So let's explore the current landscape just a bit by starting with something mundane. I know I'm going to ruffle some feathers saying this, but I just want people to know that they have something worth listening to when they listen to LeaderCast. So here's the example. Since it's almost October and as we record this, college football season is underway.
So did you hear what Tim Bias just did? He just called college football mundane in Central Ohio. Sorry, I interrupted you. Was there something else you were going to say?
No, I was just setting you up to go down the path here, so go ahead.
My home state team won't even be said publicly in and around Columbus this fall. It's referred to as the team up north. The Michigan Wolverines may be a rivalry, but I jokingly started calling Ohio State the team that shall not be named. And if there are any Harry Potter fans listening, you know the reference.
So before we go too far, we've just offered a lighthearted example because as soon as we start getting into more complex topics like faith or education, kindergarten through 12th grade education particularly, and whether your job will become obsolete because of emerging technology, people can get real passionate pretty quickly.
And where passion and opinions are present, public discourse likely is not. Last week, we talked about the role of rethinking and leadership. Actually, we did that over 2 weeks. So if you haven't listened to those 2 episodes, it will be helpful for this episode to have listened to episode 292 and 293. So when it comes to public discourse, perhaps something to consider is whether what you're sharing is an opinion or a value.
It becomes clear pretty quickly if something is an opinion when you try to explain it to someone.
So you mean like trying to explain why you're a Buckeye or a Wolverine fan? Opinions often fall apart as soon as you try to explain your reasoning to someone. If they share your opinion, they may affirm you. If, however, they disagree and ask how you formed that opinion, your ability to articulate how you arrived at that opinion might shed light on the fact that it's an opinion and nothing more. So for the rest of this conversation, we want to focus on interpersonal discourse and offer you 2 ways that you might approach modeling for others what discourse as a Christ-centered leader can look like.
So let me start here. I like this one, and that is just ask better questions. I know that seems silly, but just asking better questions involves both asking a good question that gives someone an opportunity to share their voice, their perspective, their knowledge. It also involves leading with love. That's the reason I like that. We can always ask questions that get us into trouble, and we used to laugh about this. If I were to ask a group of men, are you still beating your wife? It's hard to answer that. So no, well, were you beating her before? or yes. That's not a good question.
That's a horrible question. It's a horrible situation.
And you can't get out of it. And that's what I'm saying, that if you ask better questions, you give people an opportunity to you're actually showing that you love them because you're giving them the opportunity to be who they need to be in responding. So out of my silliness with my question, why do I say that? To ask the right question and to ask the question with love, it's like leading with love. The reason is you ask the question to listen. This is the important part of this. Listening is an act of love. Here's the part that's difficult in public discourse. You don't listen to respond. You listen to understand. That's a major, major piece. And if you're not thinking about that when you enter the conversation, you're already forming what you want to say without ever listening to what the person is saying. You're not giving them the opportunity. Here's one way to do this, and you ask how questions. That helps people reveal what they're really thinking. Their logic might even begin to fall apart. Consider for a minute something you want to have a conversation about. Now consider someone asking you two questions. How will you make that a reality? And why do you hold that view? Those are ways in which, those are two good questions to ask.
But think about how the responses to those questions are going to be different. The why question is going to cause people to double down and get defensive often. The how question, though, is going to invite them to share the formation of the idea. So how did you make that a reality? How did you come to that opinion? How did you arrive at that place where you're thinking now? They're two very different questions.
The idea is, if we are followers of Jesus and we're going to love like Jesus, we're putting people in a place where we're loving them and allowing them to say and to be who they need to say and be. It's not about us giving our opinion and everybody agreeing. It's about having conversation and learning and developing relationship. That's what I understand that to be.
And here's the reality that in my life experience, I don't think that many people want to admit, but is often very true. Many of our opinions have come about without much reflection or deep reflection or any data to back it up. It's just what we were told, and it was the opinion that we held on to, and we move forward. And so what Tim is offering to you in terms of asking good questions gives an opportunity to open up that dialogue of how did you get to that place, and to seek some understanding. And in the process, you both might learn something.
And you actually value the person with whom you're having conversation.
Correct. Are we ready for the second?
Yes.
So the second idea is to approach disagreements as dances, not as battles. So if you really want to listen and engage in conversation, you've asked a question, and then you're quiet and you listen. And you're inquiring about how someone formed that opinion or how they'd bring it to life. And now is the place that you can acknowledge, okay, here's the common ground that we share. This is what we agree on. These are the points of convergence where we can really start to have a conversation and go deeper in the relationship about what are we really even talking about. And I think people sometimes think that admitting that place where there's common ground with someone where there might be a disagreement, that it might make them weaker, but it doesn't. What it really shows is that you're willing to learn from someone else. You're willing to explore a topic. You value the person that you're having a conversation with, and together you're seeking to find the truth. It can also help the person that you're talking to consider a different point of view as well. So, think about a couple of different types of dances. The waltz, the foxtrot, the tango, the samba. Don't ask me to do any of them because I can't. And I might trip over myself. But the point is, you don't do all of those dances at the same time. In the same way, when you're trying to engage in conversation, especially difficult conversation, you don't have to share all of your reasoning like a fire hose and deluge the person that you're talking with. Lead with one thing or two things and see where the conversation goes from there. That, again, is going to model to someone that you value them as a human being more than just the ideas that you're talking about.
Let me ask you this, Sara, and that is in the midst of the discourse, there has to be a way in which if we're having conversation and emotions begin to play more in the conversation than we would like or that should, what do we do then?
Sometimes then the best thing to do is to redirect the conversation to the process that you're experiencing. So to talk about what is happening and how you have each shared an idea, what those points, we've come to a place where we have some common ground to help move yourselves to a different place in the conversation.
So then as Christ-centered leaders, it's important that we actually learn a way to dialogue with others. And being focused upon Jesus, then it seems simplistic, but I don't think this is the way we usually go. That's my perception. But to be focused on Jesus as Christ-centered leaders, and we're redirecting conversation, we're always doing it with love, patience, and humility. One of the things that I've learned with you is that we do it with being generous with people, even in conversation, that we're listening for what's best and really not for what we hang on to either, what I don't like is when people take words and they turn them around and say, well, this must be what you really mean. Listen to what somebody says and take their word for what they mean and not try to twist it around.
Well, here's a different way that that might actually become a dialogue. I'm going to go back to our silly example at the beginning. Tim, I heard you say that you were a Michigan Wolverine fan. What's that about for you? Just ask. What does that mean to you? How do you understand? I'm trying to understand who you are. I just made Tim a Wolverine fan because I need some company in Central Ohio. Stop again. Go back to where we started. Ask a question about it. Don't make the assumption. I'm hearing you say that you get disappointed when there's only 10 people in the sanctuary. What's disappointing about that to you? Is it about a memory when the sanctuary was full? Is it about a hope of having your family in worship with you? Is it about the challenge that you no longer live in that community, but you drive into church and you've seen the changes that have happened? What does that mean to you when you say you're disappointed by 10 people in the sanctuary? I just came up with 3 things that it might mean, and it probably doesn't mean any of those things to you. What does it mean? Ask the question.
So we were having a conversation outside of this podcast where you had experienced something about conversation or a debate or something where this is a tool that I think would work really well, and that is, I agree with you. I'd be upset too with 10 people in the sanctuary. But what's that mean for you?
Yes.
And then I can tell you what that means for me. But just agree with people. Well, here's one of them that I've got a degree in history. So one of the things that I think about when I hear people say, that's not who we are. And what I want to ask is, I agree with you. That's not who we are, but who are we? How did we get to this place? And then the reality is we're actually living out our DNA in this, not only in the country, but in the church. And I can go down the path. It's a whole nother podcast. In fact, it probably wouldn't be called Leadercast. It would be called Rant. But our country was founded on a contrarian spirit. And so regardless of where we go, there's always somebody that's going to feel differently. And there's always going to be a challenge because we're contrarians at heart. We may not think that, we may not agree with it, but how do we have conversation with each other when we're in disagreement with each other? And as Christ-centered leaders, that's our challenge. That's our job.
And to that, the question that I would ask is, what is it that is essential for us to agree on? And what's okay if we think differently? Let's have a conversation about that. Because you might end up having a conversation about something, if the whole focus is on what you disagree, you might be having a conversation that at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if Tim drives a Toyota and I drive a Ford. And I have been indoctrinated with Ford Motor Company since the day that I was born because my father worked for Ford Motor Company. We could have an argument about the cars that we drive and why we drive them. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. All we really need is a vehicle to get us where we need to go.
Isn't that what Wesley said about the essentials? There's unity in the essentials. The other things we just don't. We don't have to have agreement.
In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity.
Oh, there's love again, isn't there?
Imagine that.
We're only followers of Jesus, so.
So, Tim, I'm going to ask you a question, not just a question of what final thoughts would you like to add, but I'm going to ask you a specific question to conclude this episode. What wisdom would you give to Christ-centered leaders who want to remain steadfast in their commitment to modeling grace and humility in public discourse, even when faced with opposition?
I think one of the first things I would say to people, say to Christ-centered leaders, saying to people who are listening, is that who you are is how you lead. And who you are is you're a follower of Jesus. And you start there. Jesus listened to people. And so that's one of the things I would say, that if it's difficult to listen to people, work on your listening skills. Now, I know that there are some, I'm going to say this, and all of you can pray for me, and you'll become better Christians, and I may come out better too. But there are a lot of us, folks, who do not listen. We say we listen, but we don't. And that's not just... We listen
for what we want to hear.
We listen for what we want to hear. We've got key phrases, we've got key words, and if we don't hear those, then there's something wrong with the person that we're talking to or talking with. Everybody isn't... I think of it this way, and it's not for anything else other than developing relationship. And that is, everybody is entitled to say what they think or feel. Whether I agree with it or not is my issue, not theirs. And if I'm going to love them, and that, I don't have to be syrupy over them because I love them, but if I'm going to work for their well-being, I need to hear what they have to say and see where that relationship is. And if we need to redirect it, I can agree with certain things. But then ask why you feel that way. This is why I feel the way I feel. And most of our disagreements aren't based upon, this is my perception, aren't based upon fact. They're based upon what we're passionate about, and it's really based upon our emotion. It's an opinion. It's not a value. So if we could actually get to the place where we could listen with value, or make listening and a value, then we could probably do a whole lot better. And just instead of getting sidetracked on opinion, we could actually listen for the voice of God in the people with whom we agree and disagree.
I'm going back to what you said of everyone should have an opportunity to share what they're thinking and feeling. And I'm thinking of places and times that can be very hurtful to the people that are around, because they're offering their thoughts and their feelings that are directed at other human beings, and it is not done with grace or humility. And so maybe my question in that is part of our responsibility as leaders, that when we face those difficult conversations, to remind people of those two qualities of being a Christ-centered leader, and that's grace and humility. And I only say that because, Tim, you assume that all the time in other people, and that is your default, that people have that. And because my last name is Thomas and not Bias, I have that little twinge of doubt inside of me that I wonder if it needs to be named.
To answer your question directly, I think it does need to be named, and that's part of the work that you've been doing, because we know that public discourse is so difficult that sometimes just having some guidelines, some agreed upon direction before we have conversation, that's in a larger context. We've been talking about one-to-one kind of conversation. But if we do that in groups, what are the things we can agree upon and not agree upon? And then we proceed then in terms of conversation, and then we proceed on what we can agree upon and not the other. That's one way of, if we're going to start with humility and patience and love, then let's create a space where everybody we take the risk, we become vulnerable about what's hurtful, but I think we have to give people the opportunity to, I'm going to say it this way. This will tell you more about me than this conversation needs to be. But I think we have to give people to spew their poison before we can get it well.
Well, my mind's going to more of a team or a group conversation, in that I think as a leader, a question that might need to be asked in the midst of those conversations and asked out loud is spewing your poison helpful to everyone around this table? Or, as I've heard you say, are you going to feel better and everyone else around us is going to be sticky because you've just vomited all over everyone? And the idea that when we're expressing our thoughts and our feelings, our ideas, our opinions, even our values, that we're doing that from the place of grace, and we're doing that from a place of humility. That if I am offering my thoughts and feelings, and I say to you, I can't even think of something that, here's how I'll say it. Often what I see happen in group situations is that someone will say something along the lines of, well, Tim, when you did blah, 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 or there's a group of people who think, and my response to both of those is, okay, what are you saying? Say it with an I statement. Don't point to somebody else in the room and share their opinion. It's not yours to share. And don't include the mouse in your pocket and every other anonymous being and make it sound like there is a group of people who have an opinion. If you can't own it as an I statement, you're probably not able to offer it with grace and humility, and it probably shouldn't be said. That's what I was getting at in terms of sometimes things can be hurtful to people. Just allowing people to get things off of their chest can be hurtful to other people in the room. And how do we as Christ-centered leaders create the condition and the expectation that everything that is said with grace and humility so that there can be discourse around it?
I think those are tools we have to learn. I'd like to think that because we are Christ-centered leaders and that we could do that naturally and normally, and I think we have the opportunity to grow into it. That's the reason I said part of your work is helping groups have conversation just that way. Sara, if I had said from the very beginning, when you asked, what's the state of public discourse? I mean, we did say that it's not in a good place. It's at an all-time low. And I'd just say it's non-existent. It is just at a place where if we disagree, then something's wrong with you. Where we have an opportunity as Christ-centered leaders is to keep people in conversation so relationships can be built and love can grow. And I think it's missing even in our churches. We do a lot of finger pointing. And I think one of the things that Adam Grant was talking about was we tell a lot of people what they ought to do, and we judge a lot of people, and then we want to leverage people to get what we want. And he was saying, that's not the way to do this. And one of the things I appreciate about the work you've done, I think you learned that with Brene Brown, was how to actually enter into conversation with each other that values people and allows you to be the leader you need to be as you value the people who are speaking. That's part of the work. And I really wish, I know it's not true. It's just one of those wishful thinking things. Maybe I can hope it into action by putting some to the hope cycle someday, but it'll be like this. And that is because we are followers of Jesus, our entire conversation, our entire lives, which include our conversations, have not been redeemed just because we say we're followers of Jesus. That redemption keeps coming every day. I think Wesley would say that every day we're still in the midst of that repentance. That's part of what the sanctification would be, that we're in partnership with God and becoming who God would have us be. And right now in our culture, public discourse is one of the places we need to be redeemed. How's that for an opinion?
I would agree with that opinion. I think the challenge in that is a willingness to step into a conversation and be vulnerable and recognize that it might mean that you'll change and the person that you're talking to is going to change a little bit as well. And that's okay. Or that nothing will change, but you might have a deeper and better relationship in terms of understanding one another's perspectives.
Well, since I haven't said it for 3 episodes now, it does matter where you start. And if you start with Jesus, even in public discourse, you're going to be a person of grace and humility and love. If you start with your position, you're going to be anything but that, because you're going to use every tool you have to convince people you're right. And this is one of the places that if I could invite people to the altar to pray on a podcast, that's one of the places we need to come to our knees and ask God to forgive us and help us to go farther.
We hope that we may have modeled for you and given you a couple of ways that remind you of who you are as a Christ-centered leader, and a few tips for navigating the conversations, even those difficult ones, with grace. You can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/294. We hope that you reflect on how you can apply these principles in your leadership as you remember who you are is how you lead. Bye for now.